This is somewhat of a follow-up to the video I made on my main channel today, debunking the mainstream narrative of right-wing radicalization. So I'm going to be looking at some of that data from Mark Ledvich on his the data visualization he's created. But I also want to go through a thread that I posted on Twitter for those that didn't see it and kind of just talk about this issue of what the culture war really is and why the left is becoming disaffected. The first thing I want to do before showing my thread and talking about it is I want to point something out. On this, in this graph, in this visualization, you can see that Tim Pool and Timcast is my two channels. You're watching the Timcast channel. I am purple. That means center heterodox. And, you know, I had a conversation with the researcher who produced this, and I said, but I'm clearly left-wing, right? I was a Bernie Sanders supporter in 2016. He's still basically my favorite candidate. I think he's a little too far left of, he's a little far left of me, but he's still my favorite in terms of a lot of policy. And I made a video about how I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, I'm actually soured on her so much because she's just saying the most ridiculous things that's really bothering me. Because I want to better the environment. I want some social policies. There's a lot of things the Democrats propose that I completely agree with, more so than I would Republicans. But the problem is the adoption of identitarianism has pushed me away. And so what was interesting is that if you were to ask me about some kind of program where we would allocate tax funds to improving schools or healthcare and stuff, I'm typically in favor of these ideas. Now, don't get me wrong. I believe that we have to weed out the corruption, and that's one of the biggest problems. There's a lot of abuse and corruption that goes on. But I think the programs are not inherently bad. They're a net positive if we can do it right. I'm a social liberal. You guys know this. But why then would I be a centrist on this list? And the reason is, we ultimately concluded in our conversation that look, the mainstream left has adopted identitarianism. Now it gets kind of muddy because you'll see some people, you know, like Secular Talk or the Jimmy Dore Show, who are absolutely critical of a lot of the same things I am, but clearly on the left because they're focused on Donald Trump. The culture war isn't just about identitarianism, like the far left or the alt-right, but it's also just about opposition to Donald Trump, I suppose. But this brings up another interesting question. I don't think I've ever made a video where I've openly supported Trump, but I've definitely given him credit for the good things. And I almost always talk about how, you know, I don't like Trump, but I don't have Trump derangement syndrome, right? And that means there's a lot of reasons I don't like him. I've talked about it a ton, but it doesn't provide me any credits in the culture war simply because I refuse to back down against the identitarian left. So I want to go now to my thread. I first mentioned that, you know, I'm producing this video, which is on my main channel. You can go see it, debunking this narrative. But the main thing I saw was kind of what I just pointed out, that the culture war isn't, in my opinion, left versus right at all. It is a struggle between the internal politics of the left. Conservatives have always been conservative. We can't claim now that simply because conservatives criticize liberals, that's the culture war. No, not really. The culture war is essentially that the left has begun to spread so far out from center to far left that it's becoming unrecognizable. And within the Democratic Party, there is a battle. So look at this graph. I've shown this graph many times, but we're gonna elaborate. So I want you to look at this. And you can see how conservatives coalesce. They come together around core values. Here we can see in the 80s, the Democrats were rather centrist, and they've slowly moved further and further left. Now here's where it gets interesting, and this right here explains the culture war. See where it says, you know, to the far left is more liberal, to the right is more conservative. The peak, the bulk, it's actually further left than Democrats were 8 years ago. And what that means is I'm someone who's like right here. And these people are accusing me of being right-wing. Why? Because I'm to the right of them. You see what happens. You're ending up, in terms of the culture war, there are people who are within this space right here, who are liberal, who are social liberal, who are center-left, who believe they are now conservatives because the mainstream media has beat them over the head so much, they think, clearly, they must be conservative, when in fact, they're not. They're so far away. But mainstream conservatives and the old school liberals who are being disaffected believed in they disagree with the idea of race-based policy and racial discrimination. So that's the second I point up. And then I next pointed out that it's basically, I'm on the left. In fact, I mentioned that I would probably be a good example of how people who used to be left aren't anymore, because I was a hardcore Bernie supporter in 2016. And I have a friend who can attest to that. When I worked at Fusion, I was frothing at the mouth angrily ranting about why we needed Bernie, why Bernie was the right choice, and we got to get rid of Hillary. And then the DNC steals it from Bernie. My politics haven't changed. I still believe that there's an important role for the government in healthcare, education, energy, social welfare, and all of these things. And I still like Bernie Sanders. Now, Bernie, as I mentioned, is a little too far to the left of me. He's always been, but he's always come off as having the most integrity. And there's a lot of things about him that even conservatives had said throughout the election cycle that made me really like him. For instance, there was a Trump supporter that I spoke to at a rally, and he said that his second choice was Bernie Sanders. And I was kind of shocked, and I was like, but Bernie is so far from Trump. And he said, yeah, but I don't, what I was basically told by so many people is that it's not an issue of liberal conservative, it's an issue of supporting the working class. And that's Bernie, and that's Trump. Now, most people would say, who are the Trump supporters were like, oh, but they said they've been conservative, so they want to support Trump, but Bernie was right there. In fact, some people who supported Bernie switched to Trump. It was like 18%, I believe. So what they told me was Bernie is an honest guy, and they can trust him. He's been a politician, most of his life, but he's one of the few that's actually honest about a lot of things. Unfortunately, he's too weak, in my opinion. But I still would prefer to support Bernie over anyone else. Otherwise, I just probably wouldn't vote. But this is interesting, isn't it? Because before 2016, people would say, Tim, if you support Bernie Sanders, you're far left. In fact, people would call Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez far left. Now, she's further left than Bernie for sure. But I remember when Bernie Sanders was far left. He was the far left, member of the Democratic Party. He's an independent, but he's considered to be far left. And that's what people would call me. But simply because I oppose certain rhetoric, certain ideology, I am no longer far left. In fact, I'm not even liberal. I'm a centrist. How does that make sense? It almost doesn't. And I think this is what the culture war is. It's a dramatic shift in the Overton window from the left who think they're regular people when they're not. So again, I'll go back to this graph. This is where the identitarian left tends to be. And you can see how they're pulling in even further and further left elements that didn't exist in the past. And so these people who are identitarian are looking at Bernie Sanders, who's here as a false ally, as right-wing. And that's what they call him. They actually say that. He's not a real ally because as time goes on, this is 2018, it's only getting worse. What I think is going to happen is then, and I'll say this too, one thing I've absolutely resisted is that people are like, Tim, you're a conservative now. I'm like, but I'm not. Like, there's literally not one conservative who probably has a majority of policy positions that I'd be like, oh, they hold most of the things I agree with. In fact, it's probably Bernie I get closest to, but I disagree. I do disagree with Bernie for sure, but there's still a lot of reasons why I would prefer him. In fact, there's more mainstream Democrats I'd probably support. The problem is they've all been adopting identitarianism. I can't support that. Ideology has nothing to do with authoritarian, libertarian, left, or right. It's the same as a religion. And so I remember back in maybe 10 years ago, there was a big Ron Paul boom. And there were libertarian people that I knew. They were fiscally conservative and socially liberal. And I asked my libertarian friends, I was like, if you're, you believe in gay marriage and pot legalization and all these things, why don't you just vote conservative? And the issue, it was interesting, they said, I can't vote for the religious right simply because they have some policies I agree with. That's what people would say. That just because you have some Republicans wanting small government and lowering taxes doesn't mean you should support them, because they're religious. If you disagree with their ideology, then that's their guiding force, And that's the same thing that's happening today. I will not vote for the left if they support an ideology as their guiding force. Because what we're seeing now is overt racial discrimination against a bunch of different people. Look, when we see these studies from Yale saying that white progressives talk down to black people, when we see what Harvard is doing, what the NYC is doing, how they discriminate against Asian people, well, in my opinion, that's wrong and that's racist. And I would never vote for that. Why would I vote for overt racists who talk down to minorities, who think they're smarter and better than everyone else? It just doesn't make sense. And just because they agree on some social policy, I'm not going anywhere near that. So another important point is that this leaves people like me politically homeless. And that's where I got with number 6, is that basically there's a lot of people who are associated with what are called the anti-SJW community on YouTube. They're actually liberal. If or I shouldn't necessarily say liberal, but you can see that Shoe on Head is not listed as left or right. She's considered center heterodox. You've got the Quartering, who's also centrist. And the reason we're labeled as center, even though we're like, I believe we're typically on the left. I don't know people's, actual policy positions, but it's because the left has become identitarian. So the conservatives have the Republican Party. It's changed a bit for sure, but they still have it, and they can vote for that. The identitarians and those who are willing to support identitarianism on the left will just support that. But then what about someone like me, who I like Bernie Sanders, but I will not support a racist ideology? Well then, who do I vote for? Nobody. There is no party. Back in the day, you had the Libertarian Party. You still do. And the Libertarian Party is for small government and typically traditional values, but also they're not typically religious. Now that the Republican Party isn't really religious as much anymore, it doesn't matter as much, but you had that back then. What is there today? The Green Party is even more identitarian than the Democrats, so who do I vote for? And that's where we get left off. Basically, the main point I want to make is that there's two things. For one, the culture war is not really left versus right, but a major shift in the left towards an ideology as its core value. That means if you don't adhere to their non-theistic religion, as I would call it, or I should say as Peter Boghossian and James Lindsay would point out, then you can't be a part of that group because their vote, their policy is guided by an ideology. But more importantly, I said, as of now, it would seem the left will become wholeheartedly identitarian in the coming years. The left will have ideology at the top of its core values and policy positions. True liberals will be disaffected and likely become non-voters, or, I'll expand on this, a small portion will flip to the right. And I think that's where we're heading. The Overton window has moved so far left. However, while that is true, I also want to make sure I point out, that wasn't in this thread, that Generation Z is becoming more conservative, and it's likely a backlash against these millennial regressive leftists who are bullies. Look, I believe in social justice and diversity. I've made videos about why diversity is a good thing. I don't want to get into that right now because it's a complicated conversation, but suffice to say, racism is wrong. Fascism is bad. Communism is bad. Equality is good. Social justice is the fight for equality among all peoples. But capital S, capital J social justice, as it's come to be known, is left-wing identitarianism. It's an ideology that employs authoritarian tactics to oppress people. That's not a good thing, and that needs to be called out. Anyway, that's about it, but I got more videos coming up in a few minutes. Stick around, and I'll see you then.